welcome to another episode of Fantasy Reality. And rain's died down, sun's out, time for the next episode. And in this one, I'm going to talk about a rather common trope that tends to pop up in fantasy and sci-fi, and that is the half-human hybrid. Depending on the setting, in science fiction as well as fantasy, what you tend to have is at least two races, usually more, and well, usually one of them is going to be humans, and you tend to have other races. In a fantasy world, this is going to be something like elves and orcs, and of course in a science fiction world, again, you're going to have the elf type of guys that are really smart, who know everything, and likewise on the other side you can have the guys who are basically orc-like, who are really tough and always like to charge into battle. And of course you got the humans in the middle who, you know, do a little bit, know enough and do charge into battle. But like I said, but because there's these three different races, they encounter each other, sometimes on the field of battle, sometimes in more benevolent situations. And somehow, or one way or another, you end up with somebody who one parent is a human and the other parent is a member of the other race, of another race. From a biological standpoint, that shouldn't happen. Not normally. It's just not done. After all, despite what some people who like to throw out insults like to claim, it's a little hard for a human to reproduce with a monkey. Let's just say that. Despite the fact that both humans and monkeys are primates. To say nothing about a race that's from 100 light years away. Now, with a fantasy, you might have a little bit more leeway involved. And even with science fiction, there's a certain amount of hand waving that can be done. And providing you do it right. And in a science fiction setting, it could be that scientists have figured out how to blend the genetic material of humans and this other race, so that way that offspring can be produced. Or there's some sort of, and in a fantasy, but usually doesn't work. I mean, in a fantasy setting, there's a certain amount of plausibility, although you could always say that a wizard was involved somehow. But let's take a realistic approach. How could it be realistically done? Well, now I'm assuming that most of the people who are watching this at least have taken high school biology at the very least and know about the birds and the bees. and all the other stuff. I know the difference between males and females. And all the details that are entailed in all that. Because I do not want to talk about them at all. But, now, again, you could use science science and technology as a hand wave, or you can use magic as a hand wave. Some series actually do use those as a way to have it done, where the prospective couple go to the doctor, who gives them a certain amount of genetic therapy, and maybe it's the plutonium as it that allows a child to be created, or in a fantasy setting, gives the couple a potion that allows a child to be conceived. And like as I said, there's more than a few series that utilize this sort of technique. But let's take magic and let's take science out of the equation. How can two different races, two different species, have a viable offspring? There's one possible way that I can think of, and that is both species are actually subspecies of the same species. And you can actually see this in real life. A common such hybrid, at least around, is with wolves and domesticated dogs. There's been plenty of cases, like say with the Alaskan Husky and Malamutes, who are one of the parents is a husky or another dog, and the other parent is a wolf, and they get together and they have a child. Well, have a litter, or however that works, because despite their physical differences, they are members of the same species. I mean, so going with that, you could have a basis to have this crossbreeding occur. You could have a human, he's just a typical human, or he or she is a typical human, and then you have the other person. He or she, let's say that they are an orc. There could be a certain reason as to why they're an orc. That could be that the majority of their people, they lived along an area that was filled, that's like that has like a real harsh conditions that basically force a certain evolution, as it were, a certain divergence that caused these people to be muscular, strong, change their skin to green. And of course, and likewise, if with elves, maybe they lived along a certain area that just influenced them as well. Maybe they were exposed to a greater concentration of magical energies that caused them to be move more quickly, be able to be more agile, maybe even increase their affinity to magic, and maybe give them pointy ears. But they'd still be the same species from a biological standpoint, despite the fact that these three groups look completely different. And this could be a good explanation. You know, that one was exposed to some sort of radiation, the other was exposed to magical energies, and humans, they weren't exposed to either of these elements, so they stayed relatively the same. And of course you have maybe a few centuries or millennia pass, and these guys have a certain amount of divergence, but they are able to still have kids with one another. So that's a good plausible explanation. You know, I mean, when you take a look at dogs and you take a look at wolves, there's, you know, dogs and wolves, they don't look too much alike from a certain outside standpoint, you know, but biologically, they're the same species. I mean, dogs have diverged a certain amount from wolves. They got a couple less teeth. They are more able to eat plant matter compared to a wolf. They're not quite as, well, usually not quite as aggressive, although one could argue about how aggressive wolves really are. A little bit more friendly towards humans. But that could be an environmental factor, that the dogs properly raised, they have no problems with humans. On the other hand, if they're not raised with humans or improperly raised, they don't like humans all that much. As it is, you got wolves who have lived alongside of humans long enough that they're just not that aggressive, and probably would just come right up to you if you had a treat, although that's a bad idea to do that anyways. But you take, let's say, a Dachshund compared to a gray wolf. Dachshunds, you know, they're called wiener dogs for a reason. And a gray wolf, they're maybe like this tall. I'm not quite sure. I've never been up close to a real one, but I'm assuming that they're about the size of, let's just say a German Shepherd or something along the lines. My one neighbor's got, I've seen more than a few dogs. So you got your Dachshund this way, and you got your gray wolf. He's about that big. I mean, you look at all the different, you look at all the different breeds of dogs, from some that are big, like a Mastiff, this is the small little wiener dog, and yet they're the members of the same species. They could have puppies, so, again, the dogs themselves are that sort of plausibility, where you have all this divergence. Granted, a lot of it has to deal with breeding, but they're still the same species. So it's possible that the different races in a fantasy setting, they could actually all be they could all really be the same members of the same species, but due to certain environmental factors, they could all look different. Let's face it, with humans, there's also a certain amount of variation. You got people with fairer skin or light-colored skin, as in the case of myself. And then you got people who are really dark in their coloration. And then you got some people who are just somewhat tan, but still, you know, people have been having kids with one another since forever, so, you know, I mean, and let's face it, lots of times in fantasy, the whole species thing is more or less used as a tool to discuss racism. And, you know, if you just take a look at a recent urban fantasy movie, Bright, you had your humans who are in the middle, and you had elves who are really rich, and then you had the orcs who are really poor. You know, there's plenty of, you know, there's a lot of racism talked about in there. And that could be the whole, just plain racism. The whole different species, like I said, could just be used as a factor to discuss racism. You know. But, like I said, when it comes to the half-human hybrid, if these different races are completely different, biologically, it should be impossible for, say, a human and an orc to have kids, or a human and an elf to have kids, or an orc and an elf to have kids. In fact, in some cases, orcs and elves can't have kids, yet they can somehow have kids with humans? I don't know how you justify that one. I mean, they just try to justify that one in Star Trek with Vulcans and Klingons being able to produce kids with humans, but can't have kids with each other due to some sort of elemental issue. One has iron in their blood. Well, one has copper in their blood, and the other one has something else in their blood that just, I think, bronze. Let's see. One has copper. What's the other one have? I can't recall what the other one has, but they try to use it as from a biological standpoint, that it doesn't bond well with oxygen if they try to have kids. And yet they can have kids with humans. I mean, there is a quote explanation that some advanced predecessor species had created some sort of seed thing, some sort of genetic bank that does allow humans and Vulcans, as well as humans and Klingons, to have kids. But say no to Klingons and Vulcans, ugh. I think that's just plain stupid, in my opinion. On the other hand, now and like I said, I don't quite get how they done that, how the whole Vulcan and Klingon thing, other than just give it as an excuse as to why they're always fighting anyways. But, and yet why humans can be okay with both races respectively. You know, there's always a lot of metaphors in my opinion. But, in some cases, they have these two different races who, from a biological standpoint, can't have kids, but, I mean, in Star Trek Enterprise, humans and Vulcans, you had T'Pol and Tupper. There's a lot of back and forth stuff going on, where's the question of, do they or don't they? And, and there's even, quote, 2 kids that they had. The one had to deal with a time frame, had to deal with a timeline issue, where the crew got sent back got back in the past, and their descendants 100 years later helped out the crew of the present. And, well, one of the characters was, I can't remember his name, but apparently said kid was, said guy was actually the son of both T'Pol and Tupper. And then later on, some group created a Vulcan human hybrid by, again, apparently taking some blood from T'Pol, who's a Vulcan, and blood from Tupper, who's human, and, test tube baby, make it a test tube baby, basically, who apparently has some sort of genetic issue due to genetic incompatibility, and use it as some sort of... But, we're talking about racism and whatnot in that little section anyways. And yet these days and yet in the original series you have Spock, who has a human mother and a Vulcan father. And of course, in Enterprise, again, that's kind of discussed with the one doctor. It's like, well, it shouldn't be too impossible with the right genetic therapy. Something. There's that going on in there. And they actually and that's actually discussed in a number of different couples who are of different species, where the respective parents take, I'm guessing, some sort of gene therapy, so that way they could have the kids that they wanted. So, there's your science fiction thing. And with fantasy, again, you have some sort of magic in a couple of series, you have magic potions being utilized, magic spells being utilized, maybe a little bit of shape-shifting thing going on, which allows for these half-human hybrids, or any hybrid, to be born. And then you got, like I said, of course, you got the whole, what if they're all, the different races are actually just subspecies of the same species, like with dogs and wolves in real life, which allows them to have offspring. So, that's an aspect that could be utilized. And then let's think about the self-perpetuating hybrid, where the hybrids themselves are able to have children, either with members of the parents' respective species, or even with other hybrids, or other species that they could possibly have children with. Then it's like, after a while you get that creates the Heinz hybrid, or so-called, because of the Heinz 57, 57 different varieties of ingredients and whatnot. That's when things get a little, she's what and what and what? What do you mean? She's part human and part Klingon and part vampire. Sounds like something you wouldn't want to mess with anyways. And again, and like I said, the self-perpetuating hybrid, that's a concept you got to think about a little bit. If humans and orcs, or orcs are humans and elves, or elves and orcs are able to have kids, what about the offspring? How would they be able to have kids themselves? For instance, could a half-orc, half-human have kids with an elf? Or would they have to rely on either an orc or a human? Or would they marry another half-orc, half-human? And of course, what if, say, the fact that they are indeed hybrid, half-orc, half-human, and half-human, half-orc, half elf and half human, and half human, half orc over here. Could those have kids that are a quarter orc, a quarter elf, and half human? Sheesh. Or somehow they skip out all the human traits and have half orc, half elf. You gotta look. You have to think about it quite a bit. That's like. Because when you take look at one of those charts and you're trying to plot out genetics, although even in that situation probably wouldn't be all that neat, because even if one parent was half human and half orc and the other parent was half elf and half human, there's obviously going to be at least a certain amount of human genetics, and as well as a certain amount of elf and a certain amount of orc genetics. But then you get even extra crazier if there's yet another race involved in the mix. So enough to make a geneticist go, how did that one happen? Still, like I said, the half-human hybrid, if there's a certain amount of plausible explanation, it could be done. Magic, science, or having them really be members of the same, having the different races actually being subspecies of the same general species. Or, failing all that, magic potion. Well, that's it for this episode of Fantasy Reality. See you in the next episode.